Before we get started, I just want to read something, and then we can open up to questions. I want to publicly thank Yvette Flores, who's sitting up there, who's a UC Davis professor in Chicana Studies and fellow psicóloga. I want to thank Beatriz Pesquera, who is like one of the founders of a lot of these ideas. And I want to thank Patricia Baquedano Lopez because she's also part of this group. And these are the women, not so much Patricia, because she's a lot younger than we are, but the three of us that are left. I consider these women the pioneers in this field of study, and especially in creating the field of Chicana feminisms. And we use these concepts as if they just were floating around and they just emerged. And so I just want to acknowledge las soldaderas, as I think of you guys, that were the first ones to challenge men's extreme sexism in the academy and in scholarship. And without these soldaderas, the young men in this study, and obviously the young men in this venue, in this room, could not be possible. And so I feel that without their sturdy shoulders and incredibly unbending backs, my work would have never been possible. And so my heart is with you, and I owe you my intellectual existence.
And I'd like to say that you're so led up to, and this would have happened, you would have been, if you'd been our age, you'd been doing the same thing, and you carried on the work in such a magnificent way. I mean, it's like beyond comprehension how much you have done, to further this kinds of notions and work with women and men, which I think is really amazing. I have a son that went the way of prison and never quite made it out. This is such an important kind of work to do, because we do really have to focus on our young men.
Yes.
It's a terrible thing out there that's happening to men of color. Yeah. Women of color too, but I think that this is really an extension of that kind of work, and thank you so much, Aída. Yeah. And you too.
We never get to say that publicly, and we're also caught up in our day-to-day kind of struggles, and whenever we see each other, we just cling to each other and try to get support. But I think it's a rare occasion where you can say what an amazing intellectual contribution this field has done to multiple sites and how much we owe the soldaderas. And I just wrote their little coattails. I was like, okay, I'll go with you. But I'm not sure I like to think I would have had that sturdiness, but I'm not sure. But I'm very, very honored to be part of that circle. So we want to open it up for questions, comments, observations. We're happy to go in depth on any other chapters that you found intriguing. I think the challenge with any book is to provide enough overview so that you kind of have a menu of choices as to which part of the book sounds most intriguing to you, rather than a priori, sort of going in depth arbitrarily without sort of giving the audience a chance to say, okay, I want to stop on chapter 3, or I want to go to chapter 6, or whatever. So that's always the dilemma. Anyway.
Yeah, something that maybe you didn't look at, but I found very intriguing. Did you find any even small differences between Chicano Mexicano men and other Latino men? One of the things that I'm reminded of, I used to teach in Cuba quite a bit, the UC Quarter Rough program, and one of my friends taught at the Latin American School of Medicine. And he said when he taught about issues of sexuality and abortion, that he said the worst were the Mexicans and the Salvadoreños. These are, because they take people from all over the world, including the U.S. There are many students here from the U.S. that are studying at the Latin American School. He said the others were not as difficult to deal with on issues of sexuality and maleness and that. Did you find any kind of subtle differences between the groups?
You know what? I think that.
And this, by the way, this is subsample of subsamples, the Latin American School of Medicine. So I'm not generalizing to everybody.
Yeah. So I was about to say that in order to really understand like machismo, you kind of have to specify your samples very strictly. Otherwise, I think you confuse, an intersectionality is about basically specification of samples. And I think my survey training is kind of rearing its ugly head. So we wanted to see these are young men between 20 and 30 who've been exposed to the paradigms that you guys have constructed, right? So I think that kind of flattens the differences. And so I assume there are differences. Anecdotally, I think that there's different histories with different migration groups, right? And so that you're bound to have different meanings of manhood depending on those migration sort of histories. So in my, sort of very limited experience, when you're talking about Mexican and immigrants, you really are talking about labor immigrants. And they mostly come either into the service sector or they come into the fields, as laborers. Salvadorians and other Latin American sort of migrations have different motivations, including horrible military upheavals. And so therefore what they bring in, they barely cross through the border, they actually fly. So they come also from a slightly different class. And I don't think in the US we understand class as deeply how in Latin America, especially in Mexico, a very slight difference in resources it changes your class, right? And so even if you have like 3 more years of schooling than other people, you're already like towards the middle class because the poverty is so extreme. And so the gradations of class make incredible difference. So that's a project for the young men in this room. You should look at those migration histories and those sort of the origins of these different beliefs and how that affects being a man in the world, I would say, but not in this particular sample. And you can tell, to me it was just like really, it's like when you raise a child and then when they grow up, they're kind of repeating what you taught them when they were 3, and you get such a kick out of it because they think it's their own identity, right? And so that's the intellectual voicing of paradigms that the women in this room constructed. And so just saying that's the way I understand myself, that's the way I understand my work, and like you get a real kick out of it, right? But they are the beneficiaries of that intellectual legacy, and I'm not sure that that's the case once you get outside the academy. Yeah. And the other thing, this is a very, I hate causal connections, and so I want to sort of make something that Renew said a little bit more complicated. We are not at all advocating, at least I'm not, I don't know, Renew might have a different opinion, a linear assimilationist traditional view of like you get educated and then you become less sexist. Right. What these men are doing is, which I'm like, I'm just so moved by this. They've got these range of experiences in their lives, seeing women being abused or seeing their sisters not, and then they have a vocabulary through exposure to what you guys created to say that's unfair. You can't create that. You can't give them that sensitivity. You can't get, education doesn't do that for you. And all education does is help you organize your experiences into something that you can articulate and then work towards justice. And that's all it's a very powerful thing, but that's basically what we do. So you cannot create the empathy. You cannot create the feelings of compassion. So to me, that's what these young men bring into the academy, and if nobody provides that avenue of understanding, then that's where it stays. They have this uneasiness, but they don't know why. And they themselves may even reproduce it at times because they don't have a handle on it. And that's true on any social issue, right? As feminists, the discourse doesn't make us feminists. What makes us feminists is realizing, oh my God, I should have never put up with that. And I knew that, but I did it because I didn't know how to articulate it, right? So that's a slight difference in promoting a linear assimilation, like you're becoming more egalitarian the more education you get, which is a very mechanistic sociological way of looking at these cultural transitions. And the book does address that directly. It says it's not assimilation that we're talking about.
Thank you, first of all, for this presentation. I apologize, I haven't read the book, but I just bought it. So I'm curious about many things, and I don't want to take all the time. But one of the things I was thinking, and I really thank you for that clarification about education, because that was a good thought I had. So I was wondering about everyday feminism and everyday wording of feminism for men. And I'm saying this through the experience I had, first of all, before I got here and I got the wording to actually voice my own feminism, but also through my own work talking to families. I work with Latino families that had children with disabilities. And they were some heterosexual married couples, all the families I work with. And I realized that there were a lot of conversations in the home about chores, about fairness, and about things like that. I didn't study that, that was not what I was doing, but I kept like my ear there, right? And I realized how for some men that resonated and they had those conversations and they engaged. Those were not men that were having intersectional discourses in their words in terms of like theory. But they were actually trying to come up with those words. And so I was wondering, well, not only the men, also the women. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about that, or in your samples, I see that majoritarily it was all people that were educated. So any thoughts on that?
Well, you know what, there were a lot of, and I think that's what is really, you know, I was like, it's like you know, intersectionality is my religion, so excuse me. And also like, you know, intersectionality, if you read Maxime Bacazin in 1983, if you read Beatriz Pesquera and Denise Segura in 1987, we were all doing intersectionality without naming it that. So, so it's a very robust paradigm for us to understand heterogeneity and experiences. So what happens in a lot of the interviews is that and I have a paper, a chapter called Underground Feminisms, in which through a case study I argue that especially immigrant women or poor women are living feminism, but we don't have a name for it, right? Because we think of feminism in a very sort of academic way, but if you examine the behavior, then they end up being more feminist than highly educated feminists, especially upper middle class white feminists who actually have a humongous economic cushion through the relationships with white patriarchy, through the form of parents, you know, grandparents, people that get their down payment from their grandparent for their first home, or get their, we did another study with young white women, and all of them, or many of them, we interviewed, I think over 100, had some kind of trust, I keep forgetting the word, that paid for their college from their grandparents, not even from their parents. So when you've got women that raise 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 kids by themselves with a minimum wage job, to me that's a feminist. That's somebody who's like really self-sufficient. So what we encounter in these interviews is that they'll describe men, their fathers, their uncles, even their grandfathers, acting in what we would objectively name in very feminist ways, but there's no word for it. And because you're obsessed with machismo, then that's the only lens you apply, right? So then we go into the communities and it's like, okay, they tend to make all the decisions, they do this, they do that. So you're not hearing the narratives, you're imposing a paradigm. And to me, that's what is happening. So there's tons of examples in which we quote a lot of them in the chapters of, like, for example, fathers, one specific quote that I remember was about saying, okay, my father, he wanted to go to college, but his sister wanted to go to college. So what he did is he worked, this was like in the 70s, he worked for his sister to go pay for her tuition, and now she's a teacher, and she ended up not going to college, right? He ended up not going to college, but instead paid for her sister. Or you've got people saying, yeah, my father treats my mom like a queen, whatever she wants, and he comes home and helps her with housework or whatever. So there's feminist actions and orientations that we're not really paying attention to. And so I assume that that's probably happening with your clientele, is that they're out of sheer empathy and humanity. Maybe they see their wives being stressed out, or if they have kids with disabilities, maybe there's this kind of empathy that they have that overrides the sort of the gender socialization, but we have no way of seeing it, and we have no way of articulating, because we're looking for machos everywhere, right? It's just like, get over it, you know? And so that's what the basic thing is that we're trying to argue, is like, don't even, who knows if there are, and who cares? Throw that out, let's look at what people are saying and doing, and then from that perspective, let's figure out what to do to increase that kind of behavior.
Thank you, Aida, first for magnificent work. It's very inspiring. And as you know, I've been
Yes, you're
contributing.
doing the work. The real work is being done over here. She can speak to that question a lot more than you can.
Older Mexican immigrant men, by older I mean 30 to 72, who are migrant farm workers in Central California. And they don't have the language.
Yes.
But if we, again, get away from those particular lenses of analysis, we see a lot of that self-reflexivity.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps forced by the circumstances that
Yes.
they don't have a woman at home doing the daily work, but their sensibility.
Yes.
And when we listen to their narratives, the notions of masculinity that they have do not look like, Diaz Guerrero, Octavio Paz's analysis of Mexican masculinity.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to read your book and get more ideas about analysis of these interviews. So thank you.
Yeah. And I really apologize, because I know about your work, and I'm excited about seeing what the other side, right? They're farm workers, and that's why I'm saying that's the real work. Coming to do, no offense to Renew, but coming to Berkeley and Chicago, Harvard, to do interviews with these articulate, beautiful young men is nothing to trudging through the labor fields in the summer, trying to convince these people, what research is. So I really honor your work. But I think that that's an important sort of complement to this. And maybe it'll help us understand the sort of the incarceration rates, the criminalization of young men, the lack of engagement at all levels of educational success. I think it's opening up like a whole other areas of understanding. And I think that, as women, we've always done the work, so this is part of it. Hola, Lupe. She's part of the soldaderas.
Younger generation.
Yeah. Intellectual soldaderas.
First, thank you so much for your talk, and I read the book and I really enjoyed it. It was very inspiring. I had a question. So I think much like liberal multiculturalism has become hegemonic in the academy, and
Yeah.
no one is against multiculturalism.
Well, talk to Trump.
I know.
That might be an overstatement.
But I think sometimes at the same time, no one is quite for sexism. In looking at the Latino, the LMS study, Latino males study, something that concerned me is one of the ways some of the respondents were identifying true manhood is a process that ended when you get married and have children and are able to provide for your family. I think power is tricky in that way, and it might mask different answers in different ways. And I was wondering, was there any answers that gave pathways to queer understandings of family,
Yes.
queer critical consciousness, and maybe even transgender identity?
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that we did not, the way we selected the respondents is, and I love being in the field. I always hate the writing process because then I have to like disconnect from the field for so long. Because I always learn more than I ever thought. And so when we sent out the email saying if you're, we actually didn't say it was about feminism. We said it was if you're interested in participating in study on men in higher ed, can you contact us? That's all we said. And we have always had more respondents than we could interview. So there is this kind of, and that's true for the women that I interviewed, and it's true for the men. So there's this incredible need to express yourself, you know, at this particular developmental stage, which I found very poignant. But having done the study the recruitment that way, that meant that we only had like 5 gay men in the sample. And so it becomes very difficult to then sort of make a lot of, you know, extrapolations about how queerness intersects with all these other issues. The thing that was really interesting in the manhood question is that there was no attachment to biological aspects of gender or manhood, which I think is an incredible revolution, and we're not at all prepared to think about it, right? So saying, you know, being a man, if you're gay, you can still be a man. If you're a woman that takes care of your family, in another way, you are the man, you are the household. So they're very conscious as a whole, I think, of the non-essential nature of gender construction, which I think is revolutionary, and that leads to a path of opening up for queerness and for trans, right? But think about it, we don't really know, even in the academy, we don't fully understand trans. So we're not there yet. We haven't theorized it enough. It's not, you know, it's like feminism, or the notion of feminism has been around for like how many, you know, since the turn of the century, if you take into account the voting, you know, women's right to vote and stuff, and even slavery and all that stuff. So I think that at that moment we didn't ask them about trans, so we can't put words in their mouths because we didn't ask for it, right? And then the second thing is that they're not policing boundaries of manhood. Let me put it to you that way. So if you do that, then you're probably open to all kinds of variations within gender because you're not policing those boundaries, which is what they're being taught in the academy. Does that make sense? And so I think it provides an opening for accepting all kinds of different things around gender and sexuality, but that's speculative on our part since we only have 5 people that openly identify as queer or as gay.
So thank you for the book and the talk. So I've been struggling for years in this question, and Omar and Michael know this. And I feel like you're one of the 3 people in this country who could probably address this question.
I'm not sure about that, but okay.
It's a question about whiteness.
Yes.
And about masculinity.
Right.
So here's my analogy. So that in whiteness studies, Roediger has a sentence that says whiteness is not just false and oppressive, it's nothing but false and oppressive. Because whiteness is not being white, whiteness is white being. Right? So non-whites can have whiteness because it's about white being. Right? So I cringe when I hear people making an argument for different ways of being white. So for example, one could be an anti-racist white, one could be a good white, for example, but that's different from reconstructing whiteness. If Roediger is right, you can't reconstruct it. So I'm looking at masculinity, right? And I'm in not a sophisticated way playing it in my head of, is there an analogy that you can't reconstruct masculinity? So that when, like in race, if we say that, just a silly example, if we say that, oh, that white man has some rhythm, it's like he's sort of taking on black being, right? And we can go the opposite way about blacks who seem to take on white being.
Or
And
who
so-
can't dance.
Yeah, or can, whatever, you know. And so when
To
men,
choose an example.
so when men are being relational, when men are being nurturing, do we make the move that that's different forms of masculinity? And then if you keep in mind the racial example, is it more like, it's not masculinity being reformed, but it's basically feminine. So why do we call it different masculinities rather than, that's feminism? Where in fact what men have learned about women's being or women's ways of being.
Yeah.
So I've been playing this in my head, and I feel like you're one of the three people who could.
Yeah, you probably chose one of the.
Do you see
one
what
of
I'm
the-
saying? So
Yeah, I absolutely. what
is
you're saying.
masculinity good
Yeah.
for anything? That's my
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, and I think you probably chose the wrong person of the three. I'll give it my shot. I don't think all systems of oppression are the same, so I would not make it equivalent to whiteness. So and I'm not saying that masculinity is not oppressive, it is, but I also think that, and I tell people this all the time and they don't believe me, I don't really consider myself an intellectual because I don't really care about words. I really care about what happens on the ground, and then the words come secondarily. And so my struggle is always has been, and that's why I got kicked out of psychology. Psychology is nothing about building concepts and imposing them on people, and then you rate them on a Likert type scale, and not that I don't use those tools, I use, but I only use them to like make me think deeper about something I can't understand on the ground, right? So 50 years from now, I don't know what we're going to call it. I don't know if we're going to call it trans. I don't know if we're going to call it masculinity. I don't know if we're going to call it femininity. I don't know if we're going to call it feminism. I don't know what we're going to call it. I want to bring into the academy for us to think about what do these transitions mean, and how do we then create a more responsive discourse, which we are all struggling with, to really understand something that's very complicated and very much constricted by structure, right? So I just had my colleague Ines Casillas present in my graduate seminar her book, Sounds of Belonging, which is about the use of Spanish radio by working class communities. And if you have trouble with masculinity, you should like read her book, because it's like, I just kept saying, oh, because she's saying that the reason that laborers, let's say in restaurants or even in the streets, they listen to these very sexist morning shows is to reconstitute their humanity as men, because the labor is so feminized that during that moment they feel validated as men and not as feminized labor, right? I know what she's trying to say. I don't like those words, but I know that we all as human beings need to feel that we're not derogated, right? That we're not, that our labor is a positive, que no somos burros, that we're not just a pair of hands for the man, right? We need to think that if we fold a napkin a nice way as a waiter, that brings dignity to that particular thing. And that's just a human need. We all have it, right? So I understand in my mind, I can temporarily suspend all my judgments and sort of say, I really understand that farm worker wanting for 2 seconds to feel okay, right? Systematically and structurally, that's not going to lead us to a more enlightened thing, but for that moment, I'm hooking into him as a human being, and that's okay, right? Because I don't want him to be depressed, I don't want him to be suicidal, which a lot of these men are when they're alone, right, Yvette? And so, no, the reconstruction of masculinity has a lot of drawbacks to it. But the feelings that these young men are communicating to us were amazingly moving. They're caught in a jacket that they don't know what the hell to do with it. And so we're trying to understand how the hell do you take that jacket off Or, you know, as this colleague of mine said, he was an ex-priest. I was an assistant professor at Santa Cruz, and he's an ex-priest. And then he fell in love with a very beautiful woman, and he left the priesthood and had a family and 2 kids, right? And he was a total hoot, you know, he and I would have these great conversations, and I was like this rabid feminist, and, you know, I think I was 27 when I was an assistant prof at Stevenson. He was already like 55, 60, and we just had these like really great conversations, and I decía, ¿por qué eres feminista, Aída? You know, why are you a feminist? And so he would like get me all riled up, and I would like, and then finally one day he came into my office and he said, you know, masculinity is a mask. It doesn't, I can't be as raw, or I can't be as open as you are. And I so admire that about you. You know, it was like this kind of point of connection, right? And so I think that what we study has a lot of little seeds, and I think that was a seed for me for this study that happened, you know, so many years later. And then when they gave us the cover, I hated the cover, right? I just hated the cover. So I was telling this story to somebody, and then they said, you know, that's a mask. And I go, oh my God, it is so appropriate, because what we're trying to do through words and through is to like take that mask off, and what does that leave us with, right? To answer your question, I don't know what it leaves us with yet. And that we're all attempting, you know, like I guess one of the whiteness things that I read, I don't know if it's Roediger or not, it says, well, you have to like not have whiteness, because that's sort of like, until you have not, nobody's white, then you've deconstructed racism, right? And so the only option you have as a white person is to not be white, right? And that to me seemed a little extreme. Like, I don't know at what point you change and change and change until it no longer is what it was, and then it becomes neutral, right? So I had an assistant professor who had these experiments that showed people, this is like a cup with a handle. And then the handle was smaller, it was smaller and smaller until there was no handle. So was it still a cup? So she, you know, those are stupid experiments that psychologists do. But I was thinking, and so she measured, you know, like at what point that was no longer a cup and it was perceived as a glass. Because you know, you guys, you think that's silly, but really people get tenure on these things.
Endowed chairs.
Endowed chairs, right. So I don't know at what point do you question and question and question, your discourse gets molded and changed, and then we arrive at something that's truly liberating, right? So I feel very comfortable, because I'm not an intellectual. I'm like a pragmatist nationalist Chicana who just you know, like when you go to Mexico, you understand Chicanos, porque todo es revolú. Like nothing is pure, right? Everything is hybridity, everything is chaos, and that country still functions. Nothing is on time. The telephone doesn't work. It, you know, it's like, you know, you put chile in your cereal. I mean, all kinds of crazy ass stuff. And we still function. So I don't understand language enough to know how language, I'm not in symbiotics, I'm not a literature person. I don't understand language enough to know, like, at what point it's no longer restricting. All I know is that when I talk to young people, when I talk to people in the community, and I explain what I'm explaining to you in ways they understand it, they move to another place that I would have never predicted. To me, that's enough. I'm not a revolutionary, and I don't have the brain to redo all paradigms or the inclination. I just want a little tiny bit of inequality to be eroded with a tiny little bit of thinking. And that's what I do with my undergraduates. Give me anybody for 10 weeks and I can do that with them, right? And so, and then somebody can take it to another level. You know, the real big brains can like do something else with it. But my task is very, very pedestrian, very concrete, very slow moving. And, you know, there is a section that we have in the book about that was the Chicana Feminism's project. They were saying, if we write with our ovaries and we let our, you know, our guts hang out and we tell all our secrets and we call out all these beasts that were oppressing us, we're gonna get to those young men that are saying those things. I didn't believe it when Beatriz presented in 1983 and, you know, at Oaks College in Santa Cruz. I was like, well, you're not taking into account, whatever, you know, and here we are, you know, now producing these young men that are saying, I understand myself through a Chicana feminist paradigm. That's pretty revolutionary, for me, anyway, right? So, I don't know, we can talk about the race stuff, on which I have a totally other different rap, because it's a different oppression system. In a much, there's not as much, and maybe you'll disagree with me, there's not a lot of variegation. It's not as fractured as gender is, right? So whiteness is so pervasive worldwide that you're talking about a monster that's a lot bigger because it's so tied to resources and wealth and history of colonization and oppression and slave owners. I mean, men of color have, you know, it's like a lot cleaner in a way to understand it. And to be honest with you, I don't know what I would write about if my father had been, if in my history, even as a woman of color, let's say my white father had been a slave owner and they had made it with some indigenous, you know, Mexican person and produced me. I don't know what I would do. I don't know how I would understand that, because it would be a lot more tougher. I can tell you what I can feel when my dad was not, I mean, all men are sexist, sorry guys, but my dad was like, he thought his girls were like perfect, and you could tell, right? Because I'm like, have big ego. And he thought we could do no wrong, and we were like brainy, and we were like funny, and we were interesting, and we were beautiful. And it doesn't mean he wasn't sexist in other contexts, but I now understand that not all masculinity necessarily has to be oppressive, because I have multiple examples of that. Like, I require that from my partner. You know, and as Patricia says, you walk around like you have a tiara on your head. That's true, and I want to be treated accordingly, no matter what the context. And so I just think that it's a different oppressive system. But I understand your question. Yes, it's a very remedial approach to masculinity, but it's a remedial approach that, to me, within my lifetime, has been revolutionary. And maybe that's a cop-out, I don't know. But I told you I was the wrong person to answer the question. But I'd like to get your reaction.
I think that masculinity, if it's about male being and not being male, so our fathers can perform in situations, in moments of our life that are not articulated with masculinity. So, right? So when you said your father treated you as a princess.
Not a princess, it's like a really smart, kick-ass woman.
Yeah.
Not a princess. Because I had to change the tires, check the oil in the car. It was like, you know, so not a princess. I'm sorry, I gave the wrong, that tiara threw you over. Yes.
And so in that way that our fathers showed moments of care, right, as opposed to showing moments of authoritarianism.
Right.
In the same body.
Right.
I might suggest, or consistent with the understanding of whiteness, which, you know, I get that they're different systems. That at that moment is we could say that our father was not performing masculinity,
Right,
right? Despite that it was being performed by a male body.
right,
And so so I'm trying to think through that because if they are on some other level, social relations that could be compared, though they're not the same. And one could make the argument, and it's not being made, that's my point, is that there are different arguments about whiteness and what to do with it. And the one that's more familiar for me, and I've been thinking about masculinity and whether I want to be masculine,
right,
even a different form of it,
Right.
different form of it, because in some sense, when whites sing soulfully, we call that blue-eyed soul.
uh-huh,
It's called blue-eyed soul, right? The last winner of American Idol has blue-eyed soul, if you watched him. And so when I'm performing relationality and being nurturing, is that a different form of masculinity? Or is it like blue-eyed soul, I'm adopting a feminist practice rather than
I got you now.
rather than a reformed masculinity.
Yeah.
It's a feminist practice.
No, but you know what, I got you, because you know what? Because, okay, I have the opposite problem, because I act like a man all the time, right? But it's kind of deceiving because I'm so feminine in other ways, right? But many men I've worked with, and I grew up in an era where I worked predominantly with men, and I think that's why I cherish these women so much, because like I grew up in South Texas, so as soon as you started achieving educationally, you got put in the male group because there weren't that many women. They were like all doing their poofy hair, being cheerleaders, and I was like a nerd reading books, right? And arguing very vehemently in classes and stuff. So it still happens that people say, oye vato, like they slip and they see I slip into a category because my embodiment is not being enacted. I transgress in the way I act, so I'm not acting like a woman, I'm acting like a man, right? But when you are in that entails engagement at a deep level. But when you are out in the public, I am, whether I act like a man or think of myself with a crown, whatever I think of myself, I cannot go out at night without thinking about being raped. I cannot go out at night and not think about where I parked and, you know, where am I going to negotiate, what time I leave my office. And I'm extremely privileged. I cannot even travel without thinking, how far is the hotel? And am I coming in at 1 o'clock in the morning? Should I take a taxi or not? Because I don't know who's in that taxi, right? So those momentary things does not define you as something else because you're still very much embodied in something that you have no control over. So regardless of how kind my father is or whatever, he's still masculine because of the relational forces defining him that way. So that's, I mean, unless we get to cyber identities and all this other stuff, the embodiment and the corporality of these categories. It's like I always tell, this is my favorite example, and Renu has heard it 1,000 times. Undergraduates have a very hard time understanding social identities in a country that claims that no group memberships matter, right? So this is the whole notion of, like, we're not post-racial because, you know, we elected Obama. There was like 2 years of scholarship on post-racialism, and then that went out the window, right, when nobody was listening to him as president. So, so I say I use this in all my undergrad, they always fall for it, but one of the first times I used it was when I was teaching at UCLA. And I was teaching in Chicana and Chicano studies, and I said, what if tomorrow I decided I don't want to be Mexican, okay? You know, they're like stinky, they smell like garlic, I don't like the food, they're all poor, people think they're stupid, they celebrate Cinco de Mayo with Chihuahuas, I don't want to be Mexican. And from now on, I want everybody to refer to me as white, and I'm changing, I hope I don't have any people here, to Tiffany Smith. That's my new name, Dr. Tiffany Smith. And I want everybody to, and I refuse to, you know, I'm not longer Mexican. Because this cholo in the back of my clay goes, I said, is that possible? No, it's, and I go, okay, he woke up. And I said, why not? He says, traes el nopal en la frente, you got the cacti on your forehead, right? So the embodiment, you can escape it or you can reject it, but you are gonna be a white, blue-eyed singer. You know what I'm saying? So it's not about the language only, it's about the systems that impose, and therefore the language has to fit those systems, but we don't understand it. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's why. That was a tough question.